If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Proverbs chapter 9. This is where we'll spend our time today. KG and I were talking at the back a little while ago about education in general, and Brad and I touched on that subject as well. And what education has become, at least in our country, is just an inculcation of bits of knowledge. It's not become, it has moved away from what it used to be, which was a broadening of perspective, and then also a way in which to teach people to think critically about everything. And in that broadening of perspective, then coming to a conclusion about what a person would do and be. Now, of course, education is to slot people into certain realms. Whether that's exactly who they're called to be or not is kind of an open question in that way. But it speaks to something very significant that the Bible mentions, and that is wisdom. And there's a huge difference, really, between wisdom and knowledge in terms of what they actually are. The best definition of wisdom that I've ever heard is that wisdom is the ability to use knowledge. I think that's a good definition. But in our world, as we move through this world, it looks to me like wisdom really takes a back seat to knowledge in our world. Most people value knowledge. But let's ask ourselves the question today from a biblical perspective, which is more important, the wisdom or the knowledge, especially for those of us who say we are followers of Jesus. So let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 1 of chapter 9 in Proverbs. Wisdom has built her house. She has carved out its 7 pillars. She's prepared her meat. She's mixed her wine. She's also arranged her table. She has sent out her female servants, and she calls out to the highest places of the city. Whoever is naive, let them turn and hear. She says to those who lack understanding, come, eat of my food, and drink some of the wine that I have mixed. Abandon your foolish ways that you may live, and proceed in the way of understanding. Whoever corrects a mocker is asking to be insulted. Whoever reproves a wicked person receives abuse. Do not reprove a mocker, or the mocker will hate you. Reprove a wise person, and the wise person will love you. Give instruction to a wise person, and the wise become wiser still. Teach a righteous person, and that person will add to their learning. The beginning of wisdom is to fear the Lord. The acknowledging of the Holy One is understanding. For because of me, wisdom, your days will be many, and years will be added to your life. If you're wise to your own advantage. But if you're a mocker, you will bear it alone. The woman called Folly is brash. She's naive. She doesn't know anything. She sits at the door of her house on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling out to those who are passing her by in the way, who straighten their way. Whoever's simple, let them turn and hear, she says to those who lack understanding. Stolen waters are sweet, and food obtained in secret is pleasant. But they don't realize that the dead are there, and that her guests are in the depths of the grave. So wisdom is here. This is a literary term with which you may be familiar. She's being anthropomorphized. That is, wisdom is being made into a human being. So let's just take a look at the picture that's painted for us here, because it's a very Jewish one. First of all, wisdom is given to be involved in domestic chores. And the first thing that strikes you is wisdom as a woman. Now, here we are in this patristic society from which this writer writes, assuming it's Solomon. Women weren't valued very highly in that society, especially when it touched on wisdom. I mean, you had Deborah back in the Old Testament, but that's really about all that there was. There wasn't a whole lot of mention of women in places of granting wisdom to the people around them. And yet here wisdom is a woman. And the fact that she's involved in domestic chores is very significant. In our culture, we value science. Scientists have become the new priesthood. Tyler sent me a link yesterday to a talk that Paul Harvey gave in 1965, and the talk was titled, "What Would Satan Do to Win?" And the talk just went down this long list of things with, if I were to relate it to you, and I'll send anybody who's interested the link if you want to listen to it. It's very interesting. But you listen to it, it sounds like it was written last week, not all those years ago, by Paul Harvey. And he makes the case that one of the features of Satan's journey to win the world is to make science the new priesthood. I think that's exactly correct. Here we've got wisdom being painted in domestic service at home. I think there's something very significant there. She prepares a table. She invites anybody who will come and eat at the table to come. She sends out servants to go out and bring people in to eat at the table. And all of it's focused on women. The servants are all girls. I'll tell you, there's something going on here. Now, this is Jewish because you've got wine as the table fare for the drinks. We would favor sweet iced tea. But in that time in history, you didn't just go and dip water out of the river and drink it unless you wanted to be sick or die. So what they would do, she says in the text, it says she mixed her wine. Wine was mixed 3 parts water to 1 part wine as a table drink. It wasn't that you just went out and took the wine because it was very expensive. You mixed it with water. What that did was it decontaminated the water. The wine, the alcohol would kill everything. Now, I don't know what it tasted like. It doesn't sound good to me. I know that once the ice is melted really well, tea doesn't taste very good to me, so I can only imagine. But I guess if that's what you're used to drinking, there's no refrigeration, everything was had at room temperature, whatever that room temperature was, that's what you were used to. So anyway, she mixes her wine. And wine is a Jewish symbol of plenty. Throughout the Old Testament, throughout the New, as a matter of fact, when you see wine mentioned in this way, it is a symbol of God's plenty in the restoration. Now, who wants to be called simple or naive? Not very many people really like that sort of thinking. Nobody likes to be called naive in our time. Everybody thinks, I suppose because we've all got the internet and everything else that comes along with it, everybody considers themselves informed. I mean, I think that way of myself. I'll read 3 articles off the internet and all of a sudden I know everything about geopolitics, which of course is not the case, but you know, we think like that. Oh, I've read an article on that. Well, that's because none of us like to think of ourselves as simple. And the powerful and the wealthy in our culture, obviously they all think themselves informed quite well as well, don't they? I mean, after all, the celebrity culture has something to say about just about everything in our lives as far as geopolitics are concerned, morals and everything else. It's kind of funny that all this is going on right now during a debate between vaccines and anti-vaxxers, many of whom are part of the Hollywood crowd, so who knows what that means. But none of them want to see themselves as simple. None of them want to see themselves as naive. But the problem is here, and in some ways, it's what would be known as deprecatory. That is, it's something that's lowering people to tell them that they are simple or naive. But that's to not understand the text at all. It's not saying anybody's stupid. It's saying compared to God's wisdom, yeah, we are stupid in that sense. When you take God's wisdom and you compare it to anything that we might think as wisdom, it is naive. It is simple. But this is hard for people to accept. And that's why the text goes on and then brings up people called the fools and the mockers. Now, who are they? You got 3 classes of people in this text. You got fools, mockers, and the naive. The fools are those who don't want God's wisdom at all. They see it, but they don't want it. They don't think that it's anything that they would be interested in. Well, according to the text, anytime we don't want God's wisdom, we are fools. That's hard for people to swallow. I mean, I look at it and I say, yeah, it makes perfect sense to me, but that's because I've already got that built-in awareness that I am a fool apart from God's wisdom. The mockers are those who laugh at all of this. And then there are the naive. That's the classification I'd want to place myself in. These are people who are just moving through life and they need something of God's wisdom. What are their characteristics? Well, in this culture in which we live, the naive are the disposable. Remember an election just a few years back when all of the naive would be classified as the deplorable. All placed into that basket. And then you've got the mockers and the fools who do what? They listen to a different voice and they try to convince the naive to come along with them. And that's kind of where we all are. I mean, if you think about it, you know what an internet influencer is, right? You know what, everybody knows what that is. That's somebody who's become famous, whatever famous means nowadays, on the internet, and what they say and do relative to their use of, say, some kinds of products or cosmetics or fuel or whatever it is, they influence other people to do the same. Whoever corrects a mocker is asking for an insult. Whoever reproves a wicked person receives abuse. That's because there's another woman calling out here in this text. Her name is Folly. Some fall prey to folly. And I would say, looking around myself today, lots do. Lots of people fall prey to folly. She preys upon the naive and the scoffers and the fools. She doesn't prey on the wise. Why is it that somebody would take a person who is presenting them with folly and they would follow the folly? Why? That's easy to understand. Folly is always the smoothest path. I mean, in a fallen world, folly is always going to be the easiest path to anything, or at least it's going to be presented that way. I mean, think about it in terms of this. I remember when I was working in Virginia. Now, when I was in Virginia, we worked in the winter. It didn't matter what the temperature was out. There was only one day. You know, the only day we got knocked off for cold was the day the space shuttle blew up because it was so cold.
Really?
That was the only day that they knocked us off for the weather in Virginia. It didn't matter what it was doing outside. And when we got to work in the morning in the wintertime, whether it was snowing, raining, blowing, whatever it was doing, we would gather in the office trailer. Now on this job, I had to be there nearly 30 minutes ahead of work time because if I didn't get there that early, I had to walk 4 miles from where we got picked up in the parking lot to the job site. And you have to plan for a 4-mile walk, carrying a lunch bucket and everything else I was carrying in. So you best show up on time so that you can take the ride on the back of the truck into the work site. They made 2 or 3 trips up to a certain time of day, and then after that you were on your own. So you gathered in the cold or whatever it was doing outside, and if you wanted to get out of it, there was only one place to go, and that was the office trailer. Everybody be in the office trailer. It was the only heated spot on the whole job site. So this was a typical winter morning, and on any of these mornings, everybody on the job knew that I was the only believer. 220 guys, 80 or 90 of them would be in the office trailer, and I was the only believer. So guess what the conversation would go to eventually once I showed up. And this was a typical morning. And if I heard this conversation once, I heard it 50 times. We'd get into a conversation, somebody would talk about God, this person over here would say, well, you know, I believe in God. And I'm thinking to myself, well, bully for you. I mean, the demons said they believe in him too, and they're afraid of him. But I mean, at least it's a start, right? You say you believe in God. And then somebody over here would say, well, you know, I don't understand why everybody's so worried about hell. And then, of course, immediately my ears would come up. I'd think, man, you don't know what you're talking about. And you know what the excuse would be? If anybody's never heard this, then I'm surprised. But the excuse would be, well, heck, I know I have plenty of company down there. Now, stop and consider that logic for just a moment. That's folly. That's folly. It's like if you open up your internet browser, whatever that is, Google or whatever you use, what do you see as one of the first things it says at the top? It says, here's what's trending. Here's what's trending. What does that mean? Here's what's popular in the zeitgeist of the culture right now. It's right alongside the person in that crowd who I heard it, I can't count the number of times, would say, well, there's going to be plenty of company for me in hell. Jesus said, enter through the narrow gate, because the gate is wide and spacious that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through that one. That's folly. Folly is always to give us the gate that is wide and appealing, the one that looks smooth without any disruptions along the way. This is why folly is so readily followed. It's what's trending right now. Now, you have to say, all right, how is it, though, that looks that way? I think that's a real question. Well, it seems fairly simple to me. It's human nature coupled with the fact that God's got an enemy that's actively at work all the time to draw as many as possible down that wide, smooth, spacious path that leads to destruction, and to keep them away from the path that comes alongside Jesus. This enemy doesn't want that. The enemy wants people thinking like my friend who said, I know I'll have plenty of company in hell. Like it's some kind of party. C.S. Lewis said something about this that makes a ton of sense. Now, I don't know how many of you in this room have ever read C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters. But I don't usually recommend books other than the Bible. I mean, I think you should read that. But every person should read the Screwtape Letters once as a Christian, because Lewis captured the genius of the enemy that opposes us. And he said this, what the book is composed of, it's fiction, obviously. But Screwtape is a senior demon in the book who is writing letters to a junior demon named Wormwood. And Wormwood is learning how to tempt humans. That's the whole premise of the book. And these letters just keep flowing where Screwtape observes Wormwood making mistakes in his attempt to tempt this particular person who is known as the patient. And in that process, Screwtape writes corrective letters. And here's what Screwtape says to Wormwood after one of Wormwood's failures. Murder is no better than cards. Now, I don't know what you think about cards. I don't really have any energy about cards myself. But in this context, cards is being used as a kind of a symbol for licentious behavior. Let's just look at it like that. Call it poker. I don't know. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. I think that's exactly right. I mean, after all, doesn't it make sense that if our enemy wants to draw people to hell, it's going to look good. It's not going to look bad. God's forgiveness and God's restoration is new for us every morning. But you know, that's not altogether an easy thing. Because, as Lewis continues, the trouble is that relying on God has to begin anew every day, as if yesterday had never happened. That's true. Every day, you and I, as followers of Jesus, have to wake up and decide to follow Jesus another day. When you talk to some people, I just finished watching a video that a friend of Becky's and mine who was in Senegal as a missionary amongst Muslims. And she can only work with Muslim women and children. She's not allowed to work with Muslim men at all because it's a Muslim country. That idea of waking up every day and following Jesus, that's very real for her, because every day she places herself at risk in order to do what she does. I know 2 other missionaries who do the same. They have to think about that every day. Now, I'm sure they get used to it, but that's the way it really is. You and I have to wake up every day and decide that we're going to follow Jesus. We're We're completely, perpetually confronted every day with choosing God. Constantly. And for some people, folly, and I'll admit it for myself, folly looks pleasant to me a lot of times too. It's easier. It's the smooth path, the broad one, the one that's soft underfoot, as C.S. Lewis says. And sometimes folly shows up in church. Have you ever been in a church service where someone is asked to pray out loud and the prayer is filled up with flowery poetic language and these and thous and whilsts and all kinds of King James English, and you think, wow, I wish I could talk like that. But you come away from it and you realize that the person who included all the whilsts and thous and thys really doesn't care that much about what it is they're even praying about. It just sounded good. Compare that with the prayer of a small child who says, help my mom and dad get along. Which one of those looks like wisdom? Why is God's wisdom not wanted? I mean, this is an almost baffling thing. I love Dallas Willard's talk. He says his talk is entitled, Jesus, the Smartest Man Who Ever Lived. I love that title. And in it, he makes the case that for you and I, in whatever realm of life we find ourselves, if you're a plumber like Dennis, or you're a firefighter like KG, an emergency responder, or you're a chicken farmer like Colin and Janelle, or whatever it is you do, that Jesus is the most competent person who's ever lived in that field. Why not invite him along? Makes good sense to me. Why is God's wisdom not wanted? I mean, after all, it's the maker of the universe. Do you think he doesn't know? Is there some subject matter that's a mystery to him? If you handed him an iPad, do you think he wouldn't know how to use it? It's kind of silly when you think about it. But it's easy for me to understand why we don't want his wisdom. It's because of human pride. Take a small child and bring them alongside you to do something. I mean a small one, a 2-3-year-old, toddler. And you start to show them how to do something, what do they say? I can do that. You know they can't, but they say that because why? Human pride. It starts so early. We want to think ourselves competent. The kid doesn't want to think that they can't do what they obviously can't do. I can do that. I remember once, and I had a conversation with a believer once, and this was something that I thought about for years after this conversation. The believer was relating to me, and there's nothing wrong with having a good work ethic and pursuing a certain course in life and becoming successful at it such that life becomes successful all around us in terms of the fact of a house and a car and whatever. All the trappings of modern life that everybody wants. I mean, I want those things. But the person spoke in terms of the fact that it was all about their ability to earn what they had. Now, again, did they work and earn what they had? Yes. But there's a bit of information there that for me was, I literally thought about this conversation for years after this conversation, and it's this. Not one mention of the fact that the person was, well, let me just give you an example. It's like a person, and I'm not accusing this person of that, I'm just saying this is what it's like. It's like that person wants to say this or to be able to say it. God didn't give me to be what I am. I made it here myself. I brought myself into the world. Is that true of any of us? I don't think so. I endowed myself with all the talents and abilities I have. Did we all do that? I didn't. I raised myself. Who did that? Taught myself everything I know. And now I control my present and my future. A trip to a children's hospital or a nursing home will erase that kind of thinking in a hurry. In a hurry. I mean, how many people right now who are in the hospital suffering with COVID who can't do for themselves, get out of bed or anything else, would say something like that. It's a good reminder that we didn't ask to be who we are. The fact that I get up and in my prayer time in the morning, it occurs to me, and I'm not saying it's because I'm pious, it's just what occurs to me every day. Thank you, Lord, that I've waked up and everything kind of works today. My legs, my eyes, my brain, I can breathe. I made it through the night without some brain hemorrhage. I mean, to think for even a second that somehow we don't depend upon the maker of the universe, of whom it says he sustains the whole universe by the word of his power. We're part of that. That's folly to think like that. That is folly. The question of wisdom compared to knowledge is answered, in my view, and biblically speaking, by eternity. That's where it answers the question of wisdom. Might not ever be answered in this world. I mean, a person who invests themselves in something and becomes really good at it might invest themselves into something that they look back upon and question. You ever hear of a midlife crisis, that kind of thing? They look back upon their life and they question and they say, what the heck am I doing with my life right now? So in this world, wisdom may never come to an answer for us. Have we been wise? I don't know. But I do know a world where it will become an answer. I remember reading about a Greek professor, and there was a college kid who was in college and taking first year Greek. If you've never taken Greek, it's hard. You got a whole new alphabet, zillions of new words you don't know anything about. The verbs and everything are all scrambled up. It's like nothing to do with English. It's very difficult. Without a Greek dictionary, I don't just sit down and translate myself. And I've been exposed to it for a couple of decades now. It takes a lot to become a Greek scholar. Well, this professor was a Greek scholar, and he had this kid who was coming to class and just knew it. I mean, he would do the lessons and the kid would read the Greek and translate it on the spot, and the professor's just scratching his head thinking, my gosh, where did this kid get this? So finally the professor, just out of curiosity, he said, where did you learn to read Greek like that? And the guy said, my grandfather taught me. Your grandfather taught you? Yes. Well, could I meet him? The kid said, sure, I'll bring him to class tomorrow. So tomorrow the grandfather shows up. Professor reaches out, shakes his hand. He's excited to meet this person who has made this kid into a Greek prodigy in his class. He says, what do you do for a living? Grandfather says, I'm a pastor. The professor just stares at him and says, what? Yeah, I'm a pastor. He said, you're a fool. Do you mean you've taken all this education in linguistics like this such that you've become an expert in ancient Greek? Such that you could teach your grandson to read this at the level he does in my class? You've wasted your life. You are a fool. And the grandfather just looked at him and didn't twitch. He says, in which world? In which world am I a fool? Eternity answers the question of wisdom. For everybody who will live, we will all die. And then we'll find out where wisdom really was all along. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay as long as it